I am only about half the height of my esteemed colleague that went before me, which means that I need to sit down to be able to see my papers. I hope the people in the back can hear me. It's a wonderful honor and pleasure to be here with you. I want to thank the union very much for organizing this conference and every single group that contributed, and most importantly to the rank and file activists in every single organization that put their time, their heart, and their energy into making this day a success. I know from my own work that it's very difficult and takes a lot of time and patience to put conferences together, so I want to begin by thanking all of you sincerely for everything you have done to make this day a success, and I hope we do end up with wonderful decisions about action that we can all take together to make sure that there's justice, freedom, and equality for everyone in our region. I wanted to start by telling you two simple stories that I hope can carry us through the day. They are two stories I usually tell about Palestine because I think they frame very much everything that happens there. I am what they call the Lebanon war generation. Unfortunately, Palestinians, we get aged by the wars we have lived through. So I am what they call the Lebanon war generation. I lived through the 82 days of Israeli bombardment and siege of the city of Beirut. And most people think that's a horrifying thing. But the one thing I remember very strongly is how the women within the community all bonded together to make sure that all of the children, all of us, were very protected. And although we spent most of it in bunkers hiding away from the bombing, as we would be running to the bunkers, there was one wonderful woman that always said, "Don't be afraid. If you're standing up for justice, if you're on this side, don't be afraid." And I actually learned Palestinian dancing, picket, and if any of you have seen it, it requires a lot of stomping. I actually learned traditional Palestinian dancing to the sound of F-16 bombs or whatever bombs they were using at that time to bomb Beirut. And from that day on, I realized that if we're going to do this, we need to not be afraid to be on the side of justice. So I ask you to keep this in mind as you go through today, that there's nothing to fear if you're standing up for what's right. And I have seen the 6 recommendations that you came up with, and I think they're all brilliant. And if we can come out of today actually implementing these 6 motions, then we're in a really good place. The other story I want to say is that I travel quite a lot around the world to speak to trade unions, and quite often you see the spark in people's eyes when you speak about the anti-apartheid movement, the South African anti-apartheid movement. And trade unionists will say, it was us, dock workers, who didn't pick up any cargo that was coming from South Africa. It was postal workers that refused to handle mail from South Africa. It was workers in supermarkets that refused to handle the wine from South Africa. And that's when that pride in trade union action comes right back into people's eyes. And I think that's what we need to capture today. The idea that we, as civil society, we as trade unionists can affect change and will affect change in this circumstance. Those are the two things I hope you can keep in mind as we go on with today. I am here today representing the Palestinian Trade Union Coalition for Boycotts, Divestments and Sanctions. And this coalition is the largest coalition of the Palestinian trade union movement. It includes all of the trade union federations, all of the professional unions, and the independent trade union blocs. We were formed in 2011, especially to highlight boycotts, divestments, and sanctions actions that trade unions around the world can take, and to put out a very strong message that this is the call from Palestinian trade unions. The Palestinian trade union movement, stemming from our very strong belief in worker-to-worker solidarity, we appeal to the international trade union movement for support. We appeal not just for charity, but for serious solidarity actions that actually compel a change on the ground to the situation. Because the conditions of Palestinian workers today, the way Israel has made them, are completely inhumane and unacceptable. In essence, and a good way to think about it as trade unionists, is that we have done what any principled trade union does after years of failed negotiations with Israel. After years of seeing Palestinian land confiscated, a suffocating apartheid wall, increasing colonization and settlements, increasing ways of putting Palestinian workers under full control of Israel using a permit system, we set up a picket line. And all we say is we expect unions around the world not to cross this picket line. Not because we are a special case or that we are different, but because if you set up a picket line, we would not break it as well. That is what worker-to-worker solidarity means. So we thank those trade unions that have not crossed the picket line, and we hope that more don't do it as well. We base this call, we base this belief in the tried and true union slogan that an injury to one is an injury to all. That's where it comes from. For decades now, Israel has enjoyed complete impunity and from the so-called international community. As a matter of fact, the international community actually does more to support Israel through supplying it with arms rather than stopping it and holding it accountable to international law. Due to its treatment as a state above the law and its gradual and deliberate ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, particularly in places like East Jerusalem, the Jordan Valley, and the Naqab Desert, the Palestinian trade union movement is simply saying we want Israel to be held to account and to international law just as every other state would be, not a state above the law. But because the so-called international community has done nothing, our appeal is to you as civil society. That is the obligation we have, not because Palestinians haven't tried anything else. As a matter of fact, there's nothing under the sun Palestinians haven't tried to gain freedom. But I think this is the time when we can have an international mass movement of international solidarity that affects change. So the call itself stems from the fact that nothing has happened for decades, and without civil society moving, unfortunately, not much will. And I want to focus a little bit on the Gaza Strip right now, because I think it says a lot about the conditions of Palestinian workers. We have over 1.5 million people in the Gaza Strip that are literally imprisoned behind a military siege in one of the cruelest examples of collective punishment in recent times. And the international community is only aiding Israel in upholding the siege. It is incumbent then on people of conscience to actually take action. It is also no coincidence that the same governments that are helping Israel are also enforcing austerity measures against workers for a crisis that we did not create and we did not commit. So it's these same governments supporting Israel that are putting forward the austerity measures that we are all fighting against together. But what's important about the Gaza Strip is that it reveals the future for the West Bank. It's only 45 kilometers long and about 10 to 12 kilometers wide. Gaza is one of the most densely populated places on earth. Over 70% of Gaza's population are refugees, not allowed our right to return to our homes. There's a massive electric fence that surrounds the Gaza Strip and is guarded by the Israeli military. Israel has continued to prevent movement in and out of the area while subjecting the residents of the Gaza Strip to consistent military incursions, shelling, and home demolitions. This same story of an area that is completely densely populated being segregated is being enforced in the West Bank as well, where the situation will be the most difficult for Palestinian working families, forced into open-air prisons with only the ability to work in the so-called industrial zones. And I will speak a little bit about the industrial zones. These zones will be run by corporations with Israeli investment. There is very little information on the proposed industrial zones. We know that there will be Israeli state investment, but one of the things that's becoming very clear is that unionization will not be allowed in these industrial zones. And I think for the trade union movement, this is really critical, that the Palestinian labor force, the only access to labor will be inside these industrial zones where unionization is hardly allowed. We already know that such industrial zones already exist in Egypt and in Jordan, and we know that the working conditions there are miserable. We have collected data and case studies of workers in these industrial zones, and they are horrifying to hear. And this is the future that is being proposed by the international community, I should say the so-called international community, to Palestinian workers, that they should be happy with this concept of international zones. As a matter of fact, even the World Bank is proposing these industrial zones and special gateways for workers through the wall so the workers can go and work in these industrial zones. So this is the complete de-development of the Palestinian economy, linking it to the Israeli economy and making sure that the workers there are a captive workforce that can be opened and shut down like a faucet. If Israel needs workers, they will open the faucet. If they don't need workers, they will close the faucet. And that's the proposal for Palestinian working families. So this is one of the key reasons we need to be against this idea of segregating a workforce under an occupation, a military occupation. Already the abuse of workers in occupied territories has been very well documented, especially workers on the settlements in the agricultural sector. And I know that one of the things you will speak about today is campaigns around companies that work in the agricultural sector. And I know there's a big movement right now about campaigns to ban settlement trade and end settlement trade, and some campaigns for labeling it. Now, it's very well documented that workers on these colonies and workers in the West Bank in general, in these colonial entities, are receiving well below the minimum wage. They work long shifts, and child labor is extremely common. Now, I know most of the time when we are doing campaigning around the settlement trade, what most people speak about and point to is the fact that these settlements are against international law. So it's not even that we're asking for too much. This is basic international law. These settlements are against international law. But from a worker's perspective, from a labor union perspective, it is very important that we bring up the working conditions in these settlements as well. Because we have a consistent de-development of the Palestinian economy. Palestinian working families are having no option but to work in the settlements, be abused in these settlements. They are being proposed as the only jobs people can have, and hardly anyone speaks about the working conditions within them. They are rampant with child labor, and that is actually very, very well documented. So you see a full circle here of the occupation. And I think as trade unionists, when we do these campaigns of divestment, I know some people here are focusing on the company Mehadrin, for example. It's one of the main Israeli companies after the company Agrexco was liquidated, one of the main ones that has taken over the market of Israeli agricultural produce, exporting it. Now this company, besides abusing workers' rights, working within the settlements, is also stealing water from the occupied territories. It is one of the biggest divestment boycott sanctions targets we have right now. But I think it's crucial in building these campaigns that we also speak about workers' rights. Now, this link, in my perspective, is really important because these products are mainly ending up in the European Union. The European Union is Israel's largest trading partner. And when we have these fruits, when these companies are trading with Europe, they are essentially trading in the labor of Palestinian workers on these colonies. The labor of Palestinian workers who are being abused and humiliated on a daily basis. And I think that's when we need to draw the actual fact that the fruits of the occupation, very literally, these are fruits of the occupation, are making it to European markets. And not only are they making it to European markets, they are getting free tax exemption to make it to the European market because of the association agreement. Now, as most of you would know, this association agreement technically has a human rights clause, meaning that Israel has to respect human rights in order to be able to trade with the European Union. Now, we see very clearly that Israel is not doing this. One small visit to the West Bank will show you the consistent abuse of Palestinian human rights that goes on. Yet, this association agreement continues. So I'm very happy to see that today, one of the resolutions is specifically about this association agreement with the European Union. But I'm trying here to draw the link because I think oftentimes when we do Palestine campaigning, the voice of labor is absent. We hear about the conditions, we hear about international law, but what is actually happening to Palestinian working families is often forgotten. And I think when we're speaking to people on the street, when we're meeting in a trade union meeting, I think being able to make the link between a family that lives in the occupied territories being forced to take their children out of school because the economy has been completely destroyed in order to work on a settlement so that product can then be exported into Europe, very clearly communicates to people that something is seriously wrong and that we need to take action. So I guess I'm imploring you to put the voices of Palestinian labor and the stories of Palestinian working families right at the center of everything you do coming out of this conference, and I hope that we're able to do that. Of course, there's also the permit system that Israel uses against Palestinian workers. It also uses it against Palestinian farmers, who are then not allowed to be able to go into their lands to farm them. This has been one of the main methods of controlling Palestinian movement and controlling the lives of Palestinian workers. There's a matrix of checkpoints, Israeli settlements, Israeli-only roads, but with that is also the permit system. And I don't want to age everyone in the room, but most of you would remember that there was a pass system in South African apartheid as well. And that this is a very similar pass system that is being used, and it affects Palestinian working families the most. Israel carries this out on a daily basis, and the main form of control to regulate Palestinian workers is this permit system. In 2002, with the construction of the wall, farmers and agricultural workers were increasingly blocked from reaching their fields, while other workers, especially around Jerusalem, find themselves unemployed as a result of not being able to reach places of work. For example, after May 2006, the wall cut off 75,000 people of Abu Dis and other Palestinian villages near Jerusalem and left them unable to reach the city where they worked. So this is affecting people being able to get to work and confining them into places. Again, not aging anyone in the room, but if you remember the anti-apartheid movement, that's what the Bantustans were all about. The control of workers' movements, confining them to place and not allowing them to move from one section to the other. Many workers now rely on this permit system, and those that do not obtain permits to work in Israel have to wait long hours every day at checkpoints to travel to their job site. These workers are in a precarious position, of course, because these permits are short-term. So if you're involved in any political activity, meaning if you are trying to fight for anything, even in terms of your own workers' rights, if you are causing a problem to the employer, it is very simple to just revoke your permit. So it is the complete control of workers, not even allowing them to begin unions, because once your permit is revoked, you cannot even get to your job. The wall and the settlements have created a situation where farmers are forced to obtain permits to work their land behind the wall or near settlements. Applicants must satisfy the security considerations, meaning they should not be politically active, and submit land documents to prove a connection to the land. Now, this is a very circular argument. You can't get a permit to get to your land, but you need to prove a connection to your land in order to get a permit. So they can easily say, you don't have a connection to your land, we're not granting you a permit, and you sit there watching your fruits rotting on the other side. And these are the mechanisms of controlling Palestinian workers that unfortunately are not very well understood outside. And I think if we're going to be campaigning, especially around corporate targets, it's very important for us to put the stories of Palestinian workers right at the center of everything we're doing. As I mentioned earlier, the response of the international community has been to sustain this system that Israel imposes through development aid and a very neoliberal development orientation that cements Israel's stranglehold over the Palestinian people. A new innovation, as I mentioned earlier, is this industrial zones. The industrial zones require cheap labor, a mobile labor force that is highly vulnerable, and are dependent on the Israeli market and the political situation. Labor laws have not been agreed upon. I will actually be on time. Labor laws have not been agreed upon, guaranteeing a period when workers' rights will not be protected. The zones are growing rapidly, and by 2025 it is estimated that 500,000 Palestinian laborers will be working in these industrial zones. These industrial zones will cause a major problem, but the fact that they are seen as the development option for the future is really tricky. I wanted to end just on a note of actual campaigning, because I think as we think through the various campaigns that we are focusing on today, I wanted to give one example that I was involved in within my previous labor union, the Canadian Union of Public Employees. We were the first union in Canada to pass a boycott, divestment and sanctions resolution. The resolution we passed was for an education campaign within the union. And I have to say that that was a very good start of a campaign, because it gave us the chance to go and speak to every trade union local around. So I realized that doing trade union work, trade union solidarity, does take time and effort, and it's a slow process. Hopefully it will be quick after this conference. But I think the thing that holds us together has to be rank and file education. It has to be that at the grassroots level, trade unionists understand why they are fighting for justice, freedom, and equality in the region for everyone living in the region. And I think that's the strength of our campaigning, is that on one hand, it is a non-violent option, but on the other, it is also the option for everyone to be able to have justice in the area, because you cannot have one group live in peace while the other is suffering under a humiliating occupation. So that is the vision we are putting forward, a vision of freedom, of justice, of equality. But I think we need to have rank and file behind us. The way we did it with the QP motion is that we issued a pamphlet about the situation in Palestine, giving basic information. We sent it to every single trade union local in all of Ontario. And if anybody of you knows Ontario, it is a very cold place. There are certain places no Palestinian should have ever gone to in northern Ontario. And I went up there because we took every single chance and every opportunity to be able to speak to people and to connect trade union to trade union. So if we were speaking about the education sector, we spoke about Palestinian teachers. If we were speaking about the health sector, we spoke about Palestinian ambulance drivers and everything that they suffer. To give people a sense of connecting on a worker-to-worker level and to understand what was happening at that very deep level of just what is your day job, how do you go about it, and how can people help to end the complicity that is taking place. And there's much more we could say about that example, but I think it's a good one to keep in mind about initiating campaigns, but making sure that the entire union is moving with you in the initiation of the campaign. There are three things we like to keep in mind when this is within the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions Committee. Three things for campaigning that we like to keep in mind as we initiate campaigns that would be good to discuss when you're discussing the campaigning. Context sensitivity, meaning that we do things that make sense in the particular context that we are in. For example, in London, where I live and work right now, G4S, the company that's involved with Israel's prison system and has a contract with them, their headquarters are there. They have their main general membership meeting or annual meeting in London. So it made a perfect sense as a target because it is a British company. We have shares in the company, I am not very proud to say it. We went into their meeting, we were able to ask questions, and that is because picking G4S as a target made sense in our context. So we have to understand what makes sense in our context. The second point is gradualism. We want to be able to build campaigns that win. We know that you cannot come to the end of the campaign and ask everyone to have all the information and to cut all the ties right from the beginning. We need to do the educational work and make sure that we gradually build the campaign and the education within the campaign. And finally, the last point we keep in mind is sustainability. That we don't want to start a campaign, have a major launch of a campaign, and not make it sustainable and long-lasting, because that will not help any of us. We can have a wonderful launch, have great posters, have great information, and if it's not sustainable, it will not affect change. At the end of the day, what we want is for corporations, for our own investment funds, to know that we don't want companies that are complicit in the occupation, companies that support the abuse and profit from the abuse of human rights to be involved in anything that we do. Palestinian workers have always been at the forefront of the Palestinian struggle for freedom, for justice, and for equality. It is Palestinian working families that are most affected by Israel's policies of apartheid, of colonialism, and of occupation. However, Palestinian workers are not looking for charity from the rest of the world. We never have, and we never will. What we are asking for is sincere solidarity to change the system of racism being imposed upon us. Whether we are refugees outside, not allowed to return to our homes, whether we are living in the occupied territories, or whether we are Palestinian citizens of Israel that are also discriminated against as workers, we are calling for an end of this system of discrimination. We don't want aid that helps the occupation, that ameliorates the occupation, that softens the occupation and makes it easier to live with. We want solidarity that ends this system of oppression that we have been facing for decades. And just to conclude, when the State of Israel was created, the idea was that Palestinians would forget. Give them 1 generation, 2 generations, or 3 generations, they will forget. And I always end every talk by saying, I'm a 3rd generation Palestinian refugee. I have not forgotten. I deserve freedom, justice, and equality, just as every other worker around the world does. And we will continue with our campaign until that is achieved. I wish you all a very successful conference.